Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Dooley. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications at the Middle East Institute. Thanks for joining us today for our on-the-record briefing on the Israeli government's handling of the war with Hamas. This morning, we'll also touch on reporting from Haaretz of a potential, although unfinalized, deal for the release of 150 Palestinians in exchange for 50 Israeli hostages, as well as a 4-day pause in fighting. I'm joined by my two distinguished colleagues at MEI, Eran Etzion, the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and an MEI non-resident scholar, and Nimrod Goren, MEI Senior Fellow on Israeli Affairs. We'll be hearing from them on domestic calls for Benjamin Netanyahu to resign, the effectiveness of the newly established war cabinet, and the impact of growing international pressure on Israel for a ceasefire. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question. And if you are called on, we will unmute you, and then you can introduce yourself and direct your question to one of our panelists. I'll go over this again later as well, but for now, let's get right into it. I'm going to turn to Eran first. Eran, where do things stand now, especially as it relates to the hostage deal?
Hi, everyone. It's very good to be here. I'm going to make 5 quick points in terms of what I think are the key questions and issues to look into as this war progresses and hopefully grinds to a halt at some point in the not too distant future. One is, assuming there's going to be this first hostage deal with a ceasefire, the question is going to be, there's going to be a series of, shall we say, smaller questions regarding the actual execution of this deal, all sorts of minute details, how many indeed will be released, how many held by Hamas, to what extent will Hamas be able to prove, quote unquote, that it really holds certain individuals and then produce them how, and do all this under a ceasefire, which obviously is not going to be too stable. It's not easy to control, not on their side and not even on our side. And then how long is it actually going to take? Even if there's an agreement on, say, 4 or 5 days of a pause, or there's probably not even going to be the same terminology, because Hamas is obviously interested in this becoming an extended ceasefire, and Israel is interested in this becoming as short as possible pause in order to allow it to continue fighting afterwards. So that's point number 1, the ceasefire and what it will entail, and to what extent will it actually be extended, under what circumstances, to what extent will the deal be actually executed, and so on. The second point has to do with Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran, and the US. And obviously it has been an overarching question from the very beginning of this war, but it's going to be sharpened in the coming days, again, assuming we're going into this deal and a ceasefire. What is actually going to happen with Hezbollah in Lebanon? It is not beholden to whatever agreement Hamas and Israel will come to with the good services of Qatar as a mediator. Will it continue to engage Israel? And what will Israel do? And this is obviously just a small question, and there's the broader question of what will happen in that arena in the short to medium term in the context of this war. So that's the second question. The third is the stability of the Israeli government. Because of the controversial nature of the war, of the government, of the 10 months before the war, and of the hostage deal, which is also obviously a hot button issue in Israel. Will the government hold on, or will there be either a move from the right wing, from the extreme right wing, because of their disagreement with the actual deal, or from the other side of the aisle for whatever reason? And the stability of the government is obviously going to come under fire and under question. Point number 4 is the achievability of the war goals, both in terms of releasing all the hostages, because obviously only the civilians will be released now, hopefully, if indeed there is a deal. And it's not even clear if all the civilians will be released, and certainly no soldiers will be released. So at least 100 soldiers, more or less, will continue to be in captivity. And the question is, will and how will they be released? This is one of the war goals. And the second is collapsing Hamas's military capabilities and government capabilities in order to eliminate its control of the Gaza Strip. To what extent is that feasible? Within what time frame? Under which costs? And so on and so forth. That's the fourth point. And the fifth and last one, which the US has been kind of pushing from day one, and rightfully so, is the so-called day after. Even if the two war goals are achieved, let's assume for a second that they will be achieved within a reasonable time frame. What about the day after? What is Israel's plan, and so on and so forth? And we know it's already a bone of contention between Israel and the US, and it will continue to be so. That's it.
Thank you, Eran. Turning to Nimrod, we know there is a work cabinet meeting coming up at 11 a.m. this morning, DC time. What might we expect from that meeting, and where do you see things now?
So this is an important moment because people were waiting for progress on the hostage release for quite a while. But I think if we try to assess the debate within Israel regarding the war, we can take into account broader elements that relate to the mindset of the public, to the political developments, to prospects for advancement of a two-state solution in the day after, and what does that all mean to the resilience of Israel-Arab relations. And we touch very briefly on these issues at the beginning, and then we can expand on that. First, the Israeli public seems to acknowledge that policies and concepts that were in place for the last years regarding the Palestinian issue did not deliver or even fail. They include the de facto empowerment of Hamas, the division between the West Bank and Gaza as an Israeli interest, and the overall sidelining of the Palestinian issue. The Israeli society is currently mobilizing to support those in need. A lot of concern about the fate of the hostages, but also kind of soul-searching about what went wrong. And when people ask themselves what went wrong, they turn to the political level. And Netanyahu is definitely, within a very, very large majority of Israelis, is held responsible for the failure, not only the failure of October 7th, but also the failure of his policies before, and also the failure of his conduct after October 7th, because the way Netanyahu has been engaging with the public, with the hostage families, is not seen as effective and is seen as mostly focused on his own political survival. So Israelis seem to be ripe for political change, and there's a small paradox there. While people ideologically go a bit more to the right at times of war, according to the polls, the one who is benefiting politically is the centrist leader, Benny Gantz. People may seem more at ease with the former chief of staff leading the country next, but we don't know that yet. On the Israeli-Palestinian front, a lot of pessimism on what the future holds, but some major obstacles that prevented progress to the two-state solution could be dismantled in the day after, including the divide between the West Bank and Gaza, leadership changes in Israel, in the Palestinian Authority, level of international involvement that is on the rise, and closer linkage between Israel-Arab normalizations and issue related to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So there is some hope for positive progress if things are steered towards that direction. And finally, on Israel-Arab relations, we see quite a bit of resilience during the last month and a half or so. Relations have not been cut. Some of them have been either frozen or with ambassadors recalled for consultation. A lot of criticism in the Arab public on what Israel is doing. But on the leadership level, there seems to be acknowledgement of the interests that are still in place of having good relations with Israel and willingness to engage with Israel even in that tough conditions.
Thank you, Nimrod. All right, at this point, we'll go to questions from our participants. You can use the raise hand function on your screen, and then when we call on you, we will unmute you, and you can go ahead and introduce yourself and your organization, and then direct your question to one of our panelists. And if you have a question and you're not called on first, please go ahead and leave your hand up throughout the time. I'll get started. I've been sent a few questions from some journalists who could not attend. The first is from Jay Solomon at Semaphore. The Biden administration is demanding Hamas surrender the leaders behind October 7th. Has Israel thought of a legal way to handle Hamas's leadership? And because so far they've only discussed assassinations. Eran, I'll turn to you on that first, and then Nimrod.
An interesting question, but I'm not sure it's such an unprecedented challenge. We have our judicial system. There are perhaps some interesting legalities in terms of under which indictments exactly will they be charged and so on and so forth. And there are already calls in Israel to charge them under all sorts of unique clauses that were only used against Nazi perpetrators in the past, such as Eichmann and others. So that might be an issue. And maybe that's what the question is alluding to. there is the beginning of a discussion of that. And then there is the question of the death penalty that was discussed yesterday in a very contentious debate in the Knesset. It is a proposition proposed by the extreme right in Israel, the so-called Jewish power, the Kahana-like faction in the Knesset that have been pushing it for years and now see an opportunity to advance it. But I don't see it advancing too much and certainly not being enacted into law. So in a scenario in which we get hold of these perpetrators, they will be tried in Israel like other terrorists have been. Yes, with the caveat of potentially using some old clauses that were initially directed at Nazi perpetrators, war criminals, and so on. But they will be tried and sentenced.
Nimrod?
Yeah, beyond this legal assessment, I think the victory over Hamas in terms of the Israeli war objectives is not seen as primarily a legal one. I think it's about the military and governing capabilities, and those could be reached via other tools, whether it's during the war or whether there is a model in which Hamas leadership is no longer in Gaza. So I think the legal aspect will be part of the long process maybe that will follow, but in terms of Israeli reaching its objectives, I don't think that would be the major component of it.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Julian Borger at The Guardian. Who gets to say when this ends? Who declares victory in the Israeli establishment? In same order, Eran, I'll go to you first.
George W. Bush, of course. It's an interesting question again. First of all, I think that as long as Netanyahu is in power, his whole incentive scheme goes against stopping the war and actually pushes towards extending the war as much as possible. The way right now the expectations of the Israeli public opinion, the Israeli political system, and to an extent even the international system is framed, it is there's a wide consensus, and Nimrod spoke a little bit about it earlier, that the minute the war stops, the actual fighting stops, then the political process of removing Netanyahu and replacing Netanyahu begins. So he has a clear interest in pushing this date as far ahead as possible, and he has many instruments to do exactly that. So that's point number one. Point number two, there is obviously the American administration that has its own political timetable, strategic timetable, is very concerned about the possibility of the war expanding and deteriorating into a regional war, something that they're desperately trying to prevent. And there are elements in Israel who are pushing at the other direction. So there's going to be an interest by the Americans to cut this relatively short. Yes, they want Hamas to be annihilated as much as possible, but I'm not sure, and that's a different discussion, to what extent this is an achievable goal. But there's going to be a discussion between the highest echelons of the American administration and the highest echelons of the Israeli administration on, okay, what are the terms and conditions for ending this? So I guess the short answer to this interesting question is it's going to be called by the American president, and we know who he's going to be, and the Israeli prime minister, and we don't necessarily know who he is going to be.
And it's kind of a sequence. We can foresee several phases of these events going on. And first, as Eran mentioned, the issue of containing the regional aspect of the war, of not seeing spillover into other fronts, especially the northern front. That's one aspect. The second is the current scale of the Israeli military operation, which is a high scale and which may dwindle down later on. So a transition from one phase to another will be when the current scope of the Israeli military action is stopped, but then there will still be probably Israeli security action in and outside of Gaza. So the military operation will not stop with an end of war declaration, but rather an Israeli presence somewhere along the border with Gaza in and out may continue even once the level is different, and then we will enter this transition period in which the new regional realities of the day after will be formed, and that will involve regional and international actors. That will take time, but it will still probably involves some actions on the ground by the IDF, and therefore it also relates to the Israeli domestic political debate. And you mentioned the emergency war cabinet, Rachel, at the beginning, of when do those political actors from the Israeli opposition that decided to enter the coalition decide that now is the time to exit, even if some sort of fighting still continues. And from an Israeli perspective, that will signal that the time for possible political transition and a political debate is now ripe for that.
I just want to add another point, because we both did not speak about the Palestinian side of this, and it is also an intriguing point. There are several scenarios, but generally speaking, there is a scenario in which Hamas's leadership is decapitated or runs away or whatever, is no longer a factor. And then, who exactly is in a position on the Palestinian side to call the end of this? That's one scenario. The other is that they're still there and they're still operating. And first of all, this runs against the Israeli war goals. So you see, there's a certain contradiction built into this. The whole Hamas upper echelons need to be, either extricated, deceased, fleeing away or whatnot. That's kind of one aspect of it, and that's a clear Israeli goal. And the other is, if we want to end this, we need to end this vis-a-vis somebody. And that's going to be a question. Of course, Iran will have an interest in making for example, Islamic Jihad, which is a significant contingent within Gaza, militarily and on the ground. So I can certainly see a situation in which, even if Hamas is neutralized, okay, we still have Islamic Jihad and Iran pushing it. So I think there's going to be a major question in almost every scenario, who exactly is able to call this the end on the Palestinian side.
Great, thank you. I see we have a question from Stephen Erlanger, who has his hand raised at the New York Times. Stephen?
Hi, thank you both. Two questions, if I may, rather related. One, if there is a ceasefire of some kind, you can call it a pause if you like, 3 to 5, do you think there's really anxiety about starting it all up again, or will the pressure be too high? Is that a big concern? And the second concern is simply the way Israel stated its goals. I mean, if Hamas survives in any way, it wins, doesn't it? Thank you.
Can you clarify the first question? I'm not sure I got it.
Well, the first question is, if there's a pause, right, for some hostages to come out and we'll see how it goes, is there concern that the IDF will not be able to resume the operation, the campaign in Gaza in quite the way it is doing now? I mean, they may even have to allow, oh my God, journalists in.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, I spoke about it at the beginning, and that's certainly a hot button issue now in Israel. And it's going to be, virtually, I think the cabinet is now in session, and then, we have now a war cabinet and a statutory cabinet, and then the full government. And they're all now in session, one after another. So that's certainly going to be an issue, because Netanyahu and the military and Gallant, the defense minister, will say, they will be very staunch about this. Yes, this is a 3 to 5 days pause, and immediately after, we will resume the war effort, and there's no question about it whatsoever. But we all know, and they know, that it's not going to be as simple as that. So definitely there is concern. It will affect the right-wing parties within cabinet and the right-wing elements in the wider Israeli public opinion, the deep right who are against the deal, and will say, we mustn't do it because the actual significance of doing the deal is stopping the war and stopping short of achieving our goals. So it's absolutely an issue. It's going to be a major issue in the coming days. And I have to say they're right, because there is going to be a question, regardless of what's written in the deal and regardless of who says what. The dynamics on the ground, and I spoke a little bit about it at the beginning, including the minute details of exactly executing the deal and producing the hostages and releasing them one by one or two by two or whatnot, it's not going to be smooth, probably. And it might create a situation in which we end up having a ceasefire of not 3 to 5 days, but 10 to 15 days. And then what? So it's absolutely a valid point. Second, if Hamas survives, does it mean that Israel failed? First of all, depending on who you ask, but certainly there was and there still is a huge buildup by the government vis-a-vis the Israeli public in terms of the threshold, shall we say, for achieving the war goals. And there is a wide expectation that Hamas will be annihilated, cease to exist, certainly as an operating, functioning government, military operation, and so on. And various experts, myself included, are doubting the feasibility of this, certainly in the short term. And what is the short term? Weeks, months, perhaps possibly even years. So there's definitely going to be, I think, a problem there from the government's perspective, even from the IDF's perspective. And there's going to be those who will say, in a foreseeable kind of probable scenario of this ending, within, I don't know, a month, 2 months, whatnot, there will be a lot of criticism that, expectations were not met, Hamas is still there, this is not what we were promised, and so on and so forth. Absolutely.
In terms of in terms of the ceasefire, continuing regarding to your question, Steve, Israel is a bit reassured by seeing Western allies support in principle its war objectives. So when you hear the American and some European leaders, they are on board with the notion of not enabling Hamas to continue govern Gaza after that is over. So assuming that support will still be in place even after those days of pause. So in terms of the support that is the most important for the Israeli decision makers, that should still be in place. In terms of the image issue, journalists coming in, photos going out, I think we saw in the last weeks that Israel is willing to absorb the damage to its brand, maybe in the international stage, in order to adhere to its war objectives, and expect that to continue. Now, there is a problem maybe with the modality of how this hostage release will be carried out, because it's already, in terms of the leaks, the possibility of extending for additional days every time Hamas is releasing an additional number of hostages, that could lead to spillover of the ceasefire for more days than Israel initially expects, because what do you do if another day will bring back 5 more Israelis home? When does that stop, given the high number of hostages that are being there? So that will be a decision, I think, for the Israeli leadership to make. When are things resuming? And we need to remember that while this pause is in place, there are IDF forces within Gaza, and having them static over there for a long period of time usually does not mean good things happening.
All right, thanks to you both. I'll jump in with a question of my own. Eran, you touched on this a bit, but how does Israel's strategy, one of securing the safe release of hostages, and 2 of destroying Hamas completely, at times work against each other?
Yeah, obviously there is some sort of a contradiction, or certainly a tension between those 2 goals. And there is an ongoing debate, which is reflected in the Israeli media, the Israeli public discourse, and also in the cabinet rooms, in terms of the relations between the war operations and the hostage release. To put it simply, it seems to be that the majority of decision makers, and this is dominated by the defense minister and at least some in the highest echelons of the IDF, basically contend that the only chance, the only possibility, the only way hostages might be released is under very heavy military pressure. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, it means that we must continue and even advance further the war effort, and until we get the release of all the hostages. That's the rationale. such rationale might lead, at least some of them, to vote against the actual hostage deal that is now being debated. Because, they would say, once we give them this pause that might even extend beyond the 5 days into 10 or 15 days, and they will regroup. And as somebody mentioned, journalists will be allowed in. The photos of this horrible destruction of Gaza will make their damage to Israel's credibility, legitimacy, and so on and so forth. Many bad things will happen that might hamper the military effort. So that's one. And the second is, it relates to the calculation of Hamas leadership with respect to the hostages and their own fate as Hamas leadership. And here again, some are saying that, depending on your estimation of the actual goals and the actual motivations and the actual assessment of the leaders of Hamas right now in Gaza, if they believe that they can survive, they will obviously try to use the trump card of the hostages as much as they can. But what if they come to the conclusion, tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, that they're not going to survive? Will they have an incentive to keep the hostages alive or to actually execute them ISIS style? I think the answer is quite clear, but there is an ongoing debate about that. And ultimately, the bottom line, when you look at these two goals and you ask yourself, how do you want to prioritize them? You could arrive at a very different strategy from the one this Israeli government has taken. And this is also reflected somehow in the Israeli public debate. Some are saying, if they really wanted to prioritize hostage release, they would have either not even entered Gaza to begin with in terms of the ground operation. They would stop and they would negotiate for the hostages. They would release them, and only then would they, yes or no, and enter into a ground invasion or whatnot. And same goes for now. If you want, some in cabinet now are saying, I can safely assume, we must not agree to this small deal because it will stop the war effort. It will incentivize them to continue on fighting and surrendering all the hostages and surrendering themselves. And therefore, we must push on. And others will say, let's extract as many hostages as we can and then continue the fighting. But the counter argument is going to be, well, you may want to continue the fighting, but you're not going to be able to. So it's a difficult discussion, and it's certainly an existing tension between those two war goals.
There was definitely cause in Israel before the ground operation began for like an all-for-all formula at the onset. Let's release everyone and let's get it off the table and then have the IDF get the military freedom of action. Apparently there were some discussions about it, of offers made, but it did not materialize. And then you enter what Eran said about the issue of the pace. So if the thought that now is you do some humanitarian release of the women, of the kids, of the elderly, what happens to all those others remaining in captive? And you see some of those families going on the Israeli media saying today, those who will not be released in the coming days will never be released. Now that's the fear of those who are not within the category that is being released. Because if the assumption is that we are in the same modality of previous cycles of escalation, you could say, okay, so they are releasing those humanitarian issues now, but then once the violence ends, there will be the big agreement of an additional swap of those who are kind of more within the military age and others. But if the assumption is that Hamas will not govern Gaza after the war is over, then who do you do that deal with, and whether people will still be there to make such an exchange with? So I think that's a very tough question that Israelis need to tackle. At the same time, when there is such a yearning within the Israeli public to see people come home, bring 5, bring 10, bring 50, it's the moral responsibility. Whoever can be released, let's do it the moment we can.
Thank you both. Looks like we have a raised hand from Peter Coy at the New York Times. Peter, go ahead.
Hi. What is the best case scenario for governance of Gaza after the war is over, and how realistic is that best case scenario?
two good questions, you know. I don't have good enough answers. I can give you my best case scenario, which is obviously not going to be agreed upon by everyone in Israel and certainly not by everyone in government. The best case scenario is that you have an agreed strategic framework, kind of a new roadmap in terms of where the whole Gaza situation is going and the whole Israel-Palestinian situation is going, including obviously the West Bank. A new roadmap that speaks about, you know, phase 1, stabilization of Gaza, phase 2, for example, elections in both Gaza and the West Bank, new revitalized Palestinian leadership, new revitalized Palestinian Authority, to use President Biden's term, and negotiations between revitalized Palestinian leadership and hopefully revitalized Israeli leadership as well, with regional involvement, hopefully also by the Saudis, not only the Emiratis, not only the Egyptians, but also the Saudis. And then gradually, in terms of to your kind of immediate question about who governs Gaza, in that optimal scenario, there is a mix of revitalized Palestinian Authority, some Arab presence, Egyptian, maybe other as well, but in such a way that Israel deems appropriate or sufficient in terms of its security needs. And that's the tough one. Because from the perspective of, you know, if it was other Israelis answering your question, they might have said, you know, the optimal solution is Israeli security control over Gaza. They wouldn't say indefinitely, but they would say in the foreseeable future. Why? Because we cannot trust our security, you know, the kind of, they would say the obvious conclusion, or certainly a possible conclusion from October 7th, is that we cannot trust anybody with the security of Gaza, and we must do it ourselves. And yes, we don't want civilian control, but we do want security control. And this is obviously already what Netanyahu is preparing the ground for, and a lot of Israelis, including in the IDF, might agree with. And that's going to be a challenge for anybody trying to promote a more strategic, more diplomatic, more comprehensive framework for conflict resolution. Because, you know, it's, we have to admit that there is a real security problem. And those in Israel who will say we don't trust anybody else to take care of security, at least in the foreseeable future again, we have to do it ourselves. That's going to be kind of the fight between certainly this Israeli government, but possibly even a future Israeli government, a different one, and all the other parties to this conflict.
A recent polling that was done by the Mitvim Institute showed that like the most popular options for Israelis are either an international presence ruling Gaza or an Israeli full control of Gaza. Now, you know, my preferred one is different than that, and I think for those whose end goal is seeing the two-state solution between Israel and Palestinians materialize, then eventually the goal is to have the Palestinian Authority go back and govern Gaza, but, you know, acknowledging the difficulties now in having a moderate, capable, and legitimate Palestinian leadership that can do that. So there is, in one hand, a need to do internal or domestic revitalization of the PA. On the other hand, you need some transition process of who will actually govern Gaza in the meantime, ensuring that it's not an Israeli full control, so some mix of the Israeli military presence somewhere along the borders, plus some international regional mechanism, although countries are not really happy about going up front. They will prefer the Palestinian Authority even now to be the one going in with regional international backing, but I'm not sure the PA can do that. And when we look at the transition of leadership, in terms of legitimacy in the Palestinian Authority, we'll need to see elections. We saw the difficulty of that happening in previous years. We see the reluctance of many within the Palestinian establishment in doing that, and we'll see reluctance, I guess, among, you know, Israelis and people in the West about the prospects of Hamas actually being part of such an election, or Hamas-like candidates, organizations. So while elections are necessary for legitimacy, in terms of capability to govern in this reality, it does not seem to be aligned. And then what people may look at is the modality of maybe 20 years ago when, you know, Arafat was besieging the Muqata, and there was some international pressure on him to already put in place a succession process of indicate who will be the next in line while he is still in power, to provide some clarity, and perhaps that will be some of the requests from Abu Mazen. Make sure that in order to increase legitimacy, that he's already spelling out of who may be the next Palestinian leaders or leaders that could eventually enter and take over the governing of Gaza.
Great, thank you both. We'll turn to Courtney Lobel at MEI, who has her hand raised.
Thank you so much for this briefing. I wanted to ask you how, among the Israeli general public, not political elites, the US administration is being judged at this time, and President Biden in particular, his statements, his administration's actions by, the mass public in Israel.
Well, first of all, I think there was a big surprise in both the wider Israeli public opinion and in the more professional, politically aware echelons, and I think also in cabinet and the IDF and so on, vis-a-vis the actual quick, overwhelming American strategic repositioning or reposturing of itself vis-a-vis this conflict, sending the carriers, the very strong deterrent statements and so on. And it was obviously welcomed, and it still is. And will continue to be as long as it doesn't change. We'll see what happens if there is a different American administration and a different American posture. We'll see about that. But so far, so good on that particular issue. Where things get murkier is when you speak about the day after, and the more the president speaks about the two-state solution as a necessary component of any future arrangement or solution for Gaza and the West Bank, the more controversial he becomes, or at least America's policies become. I think as long as the war is raging, as long as there is the concern, and it's certainly a wide concern, of further deterioration in the north, as long as we hear on a daily basis about new Israeli casualties, as long as we are under really a state of war that this country has not seen, none of us alive has been in a similar situation. And as long as this is the case, I think America's kind of really impressive, overwhelming support of Israel will be obviously welcomed by the vast majority of Israelis. But as long, again, as I said, as long as we approach the day after, as long as there's further and further friction between the Israeli government and the administration on the day after, and also on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the more controversial the US policy and the US president become.
I would add that there is some sort of reassurance in terms of leadership. When President Biden was speaking to Israelis in the first days after October 7th, he was seemingly filling the void that the lack of leadership by Netanyahu was making in the Israeli public, the Israeli mindset, what Israelis wanted to hear from someone who would reassure them, even on the personal level. And I think the messages that the president conveyed were resonating with Israel at the time, that we are reassuring them in terms of political and military support, and that's continuing. It also reassured those that were not really trusting Netanyahu's judgments the day after, the ability of the US administration to be present in the war cabinet, in the cabinet discussion, making sure that Israel is acting in a way that should actually serve its interests, and pushing Israel to think about an exit strategy or a strategy for the day after. I think all of those were welcomed. I think the challenge is not only about the sustained involvement of the US administration, the ability to push through towards a two-state solution even during an election year, but also the ability to get the interaction between the Israeli and Arab leaders back on track. And that's something that didn't happen over the last few weeks. While relationships were resilient and sustained, they were mostly behind the scenes between intelligence officials or other channels. But on the public level, you need to begin to see the leaders engaging with each other. Maybe it should be through President Herzog if he eventually goes to COP28 in Dubai. Maybe it's building up on what the Bahrain Crown Prince said in condemning Hamas publicly, being the first Arab leader doing that, but there seems to be a place for American engagement in beginning to bring regional leaders together to converse with each other.
Great, thank you both. I have another question on public opinion, and I'll go to Nimrod first. The public in Israel can appeal any hostage deal within 24 hours if the Israeli government approves one. In what circumstances might that be the case, and how would the public move towards that?
Yeah, you may see some appeals to the Supreme Court, by especially I think by far-right actors who do not want to see it happening. But I guess those will be fringe. I don't see any meaningful Israeli actions intended to stop people from getting home. It's a very quick time, 24 hours. It goes against the public sentiments, the national morality and narrative. So I don't see that as a chance of happening.
All right, great. And then to Iran, could you talk about the security situation in the West Bank? How do you view the deteriorating security situation? Why is the Israeli army so complicit in the attacks? And how can one quell or quiet the violence?
The situation in the West Bank is bad. It's deteriorating. It's been so, actually, there's a steady deterioration, if we can call it that, since the inception of this government and the introduction of far-right elements into key national security and homeland security positions in the cabinet. This new situation inspired, quote unquote, militants in the West Bank to escalate their actions. This was true before October 7th, as I said, and it's gotten much worse since. And the actual numbers of Palestinians killed by settlers or soldiers or combinations thereof is staggering in comparison to previous times. I think I lost count, but I think it's around 150 or so that were killed since in the last few months. And there are definitely serious questions about the IDF and the Israelis' abstention from all this. They're essentially missing in action. It is troublesome. It is a concern that continues to be raised by the Americans and others, but the government is not doing anything about it. Actually, we can think of three main reasons for that. One is Netanyahu and his considerations that, of course, begin and end with his survival in power. Second is the far-right elements in government that are part and parcel of this violence under their big plan of annexing the West Bank and, either transferring the population or occupying it more fiercely, the Palestinian population. And the third are elements within Likud, within the more, shall we say, established right in Israel, that are being more and more influenced by this wave of extremism that got a very considerable boost after October 7th. And you see that in all sorts of remarks made by, people that were considered mainstream elements within government. Gila Gamliel, the latest, just today or yesterday, with an article in the Washington Post calling for the transfer of Palestinian population from the West Bank. She's a minister in government, minister of intelligence. It's an empty file, okay? She does nothing. She has no authority over anything, but she's a minister in the government. And she's not the first one to make statements like that. So we have a combination of on-the-ground violence, of more and more extreme statements, and it's absolutely concerning. And I fail to see anyone within this government who has the will and the capability to stop this, even though, of course, the IDF, the Shin Bet, are cautioning against further deterioration and the opening of a full-scale skirmish, war, another front, whatever you want to call it, in the West Bank while we're occupied in Gaza. But it might very well happen.
All right. Nimrod, could you talk about some of the specific political pressures on Netanyahu as well as the war cabinet that they're both facing today? And what is the likelihood we might see a new Israeli government in a year from now?
First, to follow up on what Eran said, and it has a political dimension of it. The statements that are being made by all kind of esoteric ministers within our government from day one of this event are causing so much damage to Israel in terms of policy. The level of tensions, for example, in Egypt, because of statements like Minister of Education Yoav Kish and Gigel Gamliel and others about pushing Palestinians into Sinai, into Egypt. It goes against the basic interests of Israel in maintaining the peace treaty with Egypt. First, it indicates that this composition of the government is irresponsible and should not be in place, but it also reflects how unsensitive people are to what are the needs and the issues that people in the region, when they look at Israel, are what is important for them. But also in terms of the composition of our government. Having the Israeli embassy in the US publish a statement that an Israeli minister does not represent the position of the government, no, that's absurd, okay? And we cannot have a government that is operating like that. And I think Israelis understand that, and it goes beyond the ideological divide within the Israeli public. We remember how the Bennett and Lapid government functioned. It was a government that has very diverse ideologies in it, but it functions, in terms of good governance, very good, and people yearn for such a sort of leadership. So that's why when Israelis are looking at the political system, we have a political process in order to change the government, and we do not know what exactly will be the political scenario leading to that. But eventually, when people are looking at what they want to see, they go for those leaders that they see as responsible. Okay? Either they have a security background, either they have a background of having proved their governing capabilities. So that's where people are looking at. I think Israelis overall want to see either elections or a change within the current coalition. They want to see political change, but again, it's difficult to do that while the war is at full scope.
All right. Sorry about that. I wasn't sure if you wanted to add a last minute thought there, Eran. We're going to wrap it up here, but if anyone has any additional questions, please email me at rdooley@mei.edu. That's DOOLEY, and I'll share it with the correct person and we can go from there. Thank you all for joining us for this on the record briefing. And if you want to take a look at any of our additional resources, you can find them on our website at mei.edu. And I want to thank our two distinguished panelists, Eran Etzion and Nimrod Goren. Thank you both for your insight, and thank you all for spending part of your day with us.